So if we haven't seen anybody else, I'll start. So let me just do the awkward sharing screen part. Right. Can you see the screen? Can you see the, yeah, got a thumbs up from Caroline, and you can hear me okay as well. Brilliant. All right then. So, well, thank you very much for booking on to this talk, Gilbert White, the Outdoor Naturalist. My name is Kimberley James. I am the Collections and Marketing Manager at Gilbert White and the Oats Collections in Selborne, Hampshire. And this is part of the Heritage Open Days Festival. Usually we do an event in the museum, but actually this has been really wonderful because a lot of you, I've noticed as you've been booking, aren't local to Hampshire, and so it's really nice to be spreading the word of Gilbert White further than Gilbert White himself ever travelled. So without further ado, I will begin. So, oh, there we go. Oh, we can see the notes. Okay. Let me just go back to, there we go. So we'll start from the beginning, but Gilbert White, an outdoor naturalist. So I got the title for this talk from this letter that Gilbert White wrote to Daines Barrington, who we'll be hearing about later in the talk, on the 30th of June, 1769. And I've highlighted the bit that struck me. He writes, "When I was in town last month, I partly engaged that I would sometimes do myself the honour to write to you on the subject of natural history. I am more than ready to fulfil my promise because I see you are a gentleman of great candour and one that will make allowances, especially where the writer professes to be an outdoor naturalist, one that takes his observations from the subject itself and not from the writings of others." This letter is a really early letter in Gilbert White's natural history career. He's only really been making nature observations and writing them down in the last sort of decade or so, and only really establishing himself among sort of the natural history community. I find this letter really sort of very, he's very much looking up to the more eminent natural historians. But he also has pretty much summed up in a sentence what makes him extraordinary and what made him, the reason why we're still talking about him today. He was an outdoor naturalist, and one that took his observations from the subject itself and not from the writings of others. So who was Gilbert White? Well, Gilbert White was born on the 18th of July, 1720. The astute among you will have picked up that this year is a big year for Gilbert White. He turned 300 in July, the big 300. And yes, and that's partly the reason that we are talking about him today. The picture that I have used here is the only picture that we know of where the artist had actually seen Gilbert White. So all the other portraits that you might see of Gilbert White aren't actually, some of them are absolutely not of Gilbert White, although might be attributed to him, or are done by artists long after Gilbert White had died. This portrait has been taken from the pages of one of Gilbert White's uni books, a copy of Pope's The Iliad, in which is covered with doodles, chess scores, from his university days, and includes 2 pen doodles of a GW, which we can assume is Gilbert White, by a TC, who we can assume was his friend Thomas Chapman. This is the one we probably most frequently use, but obviously it's not the most useful of portraits to help us understand what Gilbert White actually looked like, although we do get a slight idea of what he might have looked like from it. And we certainly know what many of his family members look like, but the man himself is a little bit of a mystery. So this is one of the portraits that frequently I see on the internet as Gilbert White the Naturalist. It is actually Gilbert White's granddad, Gilbert White Sr., who was also the Reverend Gilbert White of Selborne. I like to refer to him as Grandad Gilbert. He was, as I said, the Reverend of Selborne and lived in the vicarage with his wife Rebecca, his daughters, and his eldest son John, and his son's wife Anne. And it was at the vicarage of Selborne that John and Anne had Gilbert White, the younger. Of Gilbert's parents, we don't know too much, particularly about Gilbert's father. Although he lived a long life, John White is a bit of a mystery to us. He was a barrister, we know that, but we don't know really anything much more about him. He's pretty much silent in all the letters and archives we have, and because of that, many biographers have sort of painted him as quite a passive man that, you know, really didn't have very much to do with family life, but there's no real evidence either way. This is a portrait of Gilbert White's mother, Anne Holt. She came from just over the Sussex border. She came from she was a minor heiress, so she had a little bit more money. Her family owned land around the Petersfield area. And yes, she came to live in Selborne with her father and mother-in-law. But shortly after giving birth to their first son, Gilbert, they moved to Compton, which is near Guildford, and then to East Harting, where Anne came from, before moving back to Selborne. This is the Wakes. It is now probably more commonly known as Gilbert White's house. Anybody who knows the museum will know that it doesn't really look like this anymore. This isn't how Gilbert White would have known it. There's a couple of extra chimneys, but this is pretty much what the house would have looked like at the end of Gilbert White's life. It was actually a small house by the standard it is today. And when Gilbert White first lived there, it was essentially a 2 up, 2 down country house on the high street of the village. So Gilbert was the eldest. After Gilbert was born, John and Anne had 3 children that died before their first birthday, 1 John and 2 Annes. In 1724, they had Thomas. Thomas was sort of very lucky in the fact that he inherited the majority of the Holt, so that's Gilbert's mother's, Anne's, fortune. So although he was a businessman as a young man, he basically was a gentleman. He was based in London, in South Lambeth, and was able to indulge in his passion for botany, and that's a theme that will appear a lot in as we go through Gilbert White's family, that they were all interested in various aspects of natural history. He was a member of the Royal Society, and probably introduced Gilbert White into that community. We know that he was instrumental in getting Gilbert White's letters read out at the Royal Society. The next of Gilbert White's siblings, a year later in 1725, was Benjamin. Benjamin was a bookseller. His business was based on Fleet Street under the sign of Horace's Head, and specialised in natural history, if you can believe it. The booksellers was in the very heart of sort of intellectual London, and really only a stone's throw from the Royal Society headquarters. So he would have got a lot of traffic from the various gentlemen coming from the Royal Society and then visiting his bookshop. And on our YouTube page, we've got an excellent video from our Gilbert White's Birthday online festival about Gilbert White and London, where Stephanie West from the Natural History Museum goes into some detail about sort of where everything was happening in terms of London and how that affected Gilbert White's natural history. After Benjamin is Anne. So now I haven't got my notes. This is a real test of my Gilbert White brother and sister knowledge. Actually, I think it's Rebecca. After Rebecca is John. John was born in 1727. He is often referred to as the black sheep of the family, although we don't quite know why that is, most probably due to the fact that he might have gambled whilst at university. But anyway, he ended up as chaplain in Gibraltar and was also incredibly interested in natural history. He tried to write a natural history of Gibraltar. He was in personal contact with Carl Linnaeus and was really instrumental in Gilbert White's understanding of the flora and fauna of that part of the world. John would often try and send specimens from Gibraltar to Selborne, and in an age where travel took many months and there was no way of preserving specimens, you can just imagine what state these animals would have ended up in by the time they arrived in Selborne. I think Gilbert ended up just sort of chucking them away. There was, after John, there was Francis, who we don't know very much about because he died as a very young man, and then Anne, who married a gentleman who was very keen in natural history, who Gilbert White corresponded with regularly. And then the last White sibling was Henry. You might think that this is a strange picture of Henry to choose. The reason I've chose it is thus. This is from the Natural History of Selborne. It's one of the original Grimm illustrations. It is of the hermitage which Gilbert White erected on top of the Selborne Hanger, just above the zigzag path. Gilbert White used to host parties up in the hermitage and would arrange for the hermit to visit the young ladies and to tell stories to them, you know, and to jump out at them and frighten them and things like that. And often the hermit was Harry dressed up. So I like to think that although this is a purely imaginative depiction of the hermitage, it is the handsome Henry dressed up as the hermit. So the family grew up in Selborne. Gilbert White lived in Selborne from about the age of 8 years old until the age of 72. This is also from the Natural History of Selborne and sort of gives you an idea of what Selborne was like in the 18th century. It was a small village made up of predominantly one street, which is still the general layout of the village. On one side, it is dominated by the Selborne Hanger, which is a steep hill covered in beech trees. On top of the hanger is Selborne Common. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner as well, there is a stream, there's a little river. But what makes Selborne so special for a family like the Whites, and is still the case today, is it is incredibly diverse in its habitats, in its soil, in the sheer density of the wildlife that it attracts. I mean, and more so in the early 18th century than today, but even still, it is a hotspot for naturalists to come, because it is such a rich and diverse area in terms of its biodiversity. So really, a family growing up here could really, they had no choice but to grow up naturalists. Gilbert White was educated as a boy in Basingstoke. He was under the tutelage of the Reverend Thomas Wharton, who was once poetry professor at Magdalen College, Oxford. He would have been educated alongside Wharton's two sons, one which was to grow up a literary critic, the other poet laureate. They were a little bit younger than Gilbert, but they most definitely would have been schooled together and prepared for university. Now, Gilbert, you would have thought, would have gone to Magdalen. After all, his tutor was a Magdalen professor. His grandfather went to Magdalen, and Selborne was a living that belonged to Magdalen College, but Gilbert followed his uncle's footsteps and went to Oriel College. And I'm fairly certain that the 19-year-old Gilbert would be horrified by the idea that his life would be synonymous with the village that he grew up in, and that one day he might want to be Vicar of Selborne. He really loved Oxford, and his young years, his 20s in particular, were in pursuit of really trying to embed a career in the Oxford world. And I can imagine being in that academic world in the 18th century with all those great minds would have been a really inspiring place. He was proctor for a while, stayed there for a few years trying to establish himself, but to no real avail. A bit later on, he applied for the post of provost, didn't get that, but Oxford always had a very special place in his heart, and he really did try and have a career as an Oxford Don. It was also whilst in Oxford that he almost was married. According to the letters of his lifelong friend, John Mulso, Gilbert White came very close to marrying a lady called Jenny Croke, who was the daughter of Gilbert's haberdasher. Gilbert spent an awful lot of money on clothes whilst at Oxford, clearly wanting to spend a bit more time with Jenny, and is teased by his friends about becoming a young groom when, you know, he has his whole life ahead of him. Anybody who knows Gilbert White will know that actually he never married. But this is the closest that he got, and even 10 years later when Jenny appears in correspondence again, nothing ever happened there. So Oriel gave Gilbert White a living. After he was ordained, he was given the living of Morton Pinkney, which is in Northamptonshire. However, Gilbert White had no intention of living in Northamptonshire, so accepted it on the proviso that he would either that he would have a curate at Morton Pinckney, and he himself would do curate work, with the hope that something better would come along, either a job at Oxford or a Hampshire living would become available. He worked as the curate of his uncle for a long time, and also had appointments in Wiltshire and all over Hampshire. So he would have travelled the length and breadth of the county quite a lot in his youth. It's also during his sort of 30s that he really starts establishing himself as a gardener. Back at home, back in Selborne, in the family home, he starts making quite considerable changes to the garden, sort of fashioning it as a 18th century landscape garden on a budget. I'm not going to go too much into Gilbert White as a gardener, but there are some fantastic videos on our YouTube page about Gilbert White as a gardener. But the one thing that I will mention is that he starts recording his gardening activities in a garden calendar. And this wasn't unusual for the 18th century. Many keen gardeners kept a garden diary or a garden calendar. But what Gilbert was doing is was getting into the practice of recording frequently, and this was a habit that he would keep for the rest of his life. The garden calendar spans a couple of decades, but what you notice is, although it is a garden diary, nature observations start to creep in. Gilbert White couldn't help but, in his garden, which opened up onto the Selborne Hanger, noticing the natural world. He couldn't help but notice the natural world as he travelled from parish to parish. And those notes creep into his garden diaries until he starts writing his naturalist diaries, which are sort of the opposite. Those are nature diaries with gardening updates in them. The first nature observation that Gilbert White makes is in the year 1759. Now, the year 1759 is actually quite a poignant year for Gilbert White. It wasn't a great year for him at all. His sort of last chance at a job at Oxford sort of slips through his fingers. His father dies, and that causes its own problems because Oriel College now assume that Gilbert White is now financially independent. That was far from the case. He was actually, his inheritance lay with his uncle, and he had to basically beg the college not to take away his fellowship, which was a vital source of income for Gilbert. And this made him pretty unpopular at Oriel College. He was 39 years old. He wasn't married. He, hadn't really established a career for himself. So it wasn't a great year. But in November, he notes for the first time in a diary that house martins were swooping around the hanger and were unusually late, which one shows that Gilbert White was very aware of when was usual and unusual for certain birds to be seen. So he'd clearly been keeping a close account of migratory patterns and things like that. But this is the first time that he puts it down on paper, and it is the start really of his career as a naturalist. And I think it's telling that in the same year that basically his things are really falling apart for Gilbert White, that actually what he is known for and what becomes his sort of lifelong passion begins officially in paper. So Gilbert White isn't only writing diaries. I mean, his diaries carry on until the very end of his life. and aren't just a nature diary. They're not just gardening diaries. They are, he notes meteorology, astronomy, new inventions. The only thing really that Gilbert White's diaries don't have in them are current affairs. You don't look to Gilbert White for the news. But he was also writing letters. Gilbert White would have been visiting his brothers in London a lot, and his brothers would have introduced Gilbert to some of the eminent naturalists that they knew. So the gentleman in the red robe is Daines Barrington, who was the recipient of the letter at the very beginning of the lecture. He was a barrister as well as a naturalist, and actually he also sort of collected oddities. So he was actually he visited a very young Mozart to test Mozart to see whether he really was the genius that everybody said he was. He also went to visit the last speaker of Cornish to record that sort of phenomenon as well. The gentleman in the blue jacket is Thomas Pennant. Thomas Pennant was a writer. He had published his work, A British Zoology, which had been published by Benjamin White. So it's pretty plausible that Gilbert met Thomas Pennant through Benjamin. And at the beginning of their correspondence in the 1760s, Gilbert White really is the very epitome of an amateur naturalist. But as the decades roll on, they cover pretty much between them every subject conceivable, and Gilbert White grows in confidence in his own power of observation and his own knowledge of the natural world. So by the sort of opposite end, you get Gilbert White advising Thomas Pennant on all the mistakes he made in the first edition of the British Zoology, and now that he's writing the second, all the things that he could do better. So Gilbert White had been writing these letters for decades and decades, and these two aren't the only people that Gilbert White wrote to. He also was in correspondence with lots of other people in the field of natural history, but these two are the correspondence that he decided to use for his Natural History of Selborne. So the Natural History of Selborne, or to give it its full title, The Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne, is an amalgamation of the letters between Daines Barrington and Thomas Pennant. It is literally the real letters. It's lost my train of thought there. So the letters are all his real letters. So he basically just asked Thomas Pennant and Daines Barrington for his letters back, and then added 9 letters at the beginning, which were sort of context building. So they're about different aspects of Selborne, and including a very detailed one about the different types of soil and habitats that you can find in Selborne. There was also a latter part of the book, which was the Antiquities of Selborne, which is basically an historical account of the village of Selborne, which Gilbert White is an extraordinary natural historian, but he usually, modern editions do not include the Antiquities. So once receiving the letters back, Gilbert White, as you can see, here we've got a picture of the manuscript, which we're very lucky in the museum to hold. They were edited heavily, so you can see quite a few crossings out. There's notes bits added in, things cut out. There's also a few different handwritings in the manuscript, one of which is his niece, Molly. Molly White is a fantastic character. She was involved in the copy editing of the Natural History of Selborne and was very involved in the research for the antiquities. And again, on our YouTube page, there's a really fantastic video about how the natural history was really a family affair and how much Molly had to do with its creation. The book was published in 1789, and this is the advertisement that Gilbert White wrote at the very beginning, and I think it pretty much sums up exactly what it did. If the writer should at all appear to have induced any of his readers to pay a more ready attention to the wonders of the creation, too frequently overlooked as common occurrences, what Gilbert White wanted the book to do was to inspire people to do what he had done, to get out into their local environments and to notice nature, to understand nature more and to be in awe of nature, which I think really is as relevant today as it was 231 years ago, and why the book is still widely read today, despite the fact it was written pre-Darwin, and you know, is just simply a book written by a Hampshire clergyman. 4 years after Gilbert White published the book, he died at the age of just shy of 73. He was buried just outside of Selborne Church. This is his gravestone today. You can't see it very well now, but it is engraved simply with his initials and the date of his death. It's quite easy to miss, actually, if you don't know what you are looking for. But that's exactly what Gilbert White requested on his death. And when he died, he was not nearly the superstar that he would be in years to come. The book had done okay. It had got good reviews. It had sold okay, but it hadn't gone to second edition and wouldn't until 1802. But I'm sure Gilbert White would have been fairly happy with how his life had gone. He had put out into the world his work. It had been well received, and he had sort of done what he had set out to do. However, fast forward a couple of decades, we are now in the 19th century, and the brother of Jane Austen, who lived just a couple of miles away in Chawton, wrote this in 1812. Who talks of rational delight when Selborne's hill appears in sight, and does not think of Gilbert White? By the time James Austen was writing this, Gilbert White was already a household name in a way that he wasn't in the 1790s when Gilbert White died. Something had definitely happened in those couple of decades. The book had gone into second edition, and now was widely read. We know that the Wordsworths had a copy, the Brontes had read it. It was beginning to be a sort of a staple of everybody's bookshelves. The name Gilbert White was synonymous with natural history in a way that today David Attenborough's is synonymous with natural history. People might not have ever watched blue planet, but they know who David Attenborough is and they know what he's about. In the same way, in the 19th century, people might not have read Gilbert White, but they had it on their bookshelf, and they, you know, White Selborne was synonymous with natural history. It is now considered to be the fourth most published book in the English language. In the 19th century, it absolutely exploded in popularity, being published in America, Canada, Australia, and then in the 20th century, all over Europe, and it's very popular in Japan. It very much it changed the way that people looked at nature completely. And this is because of the way that it was written. The fact that it's in letter form means that it's very easy to read, it's very familiar, it's very friendly. Gilbert White was writing, after all, to friends, and that's what you feel like you are reading when you read it. You're reading letters between friends. It's littered with jokes, with stories that Gilbert White is reminiscing, juxtaposed with the science that is happening on every single page. It also is written in the most beautiful lyrical language. You could be forgiven for thinking at times that you are reading poetry. Gilbert White did write poetry. In fact, he wrote a poem about how nervous he was about the Natural History of Selborne being published at one point. But you can very much tell that he was well read and that his tutor was a poetry professor. It's very, very beautifully written, and he's one of the last nature writers writing before the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. The Natural History of Selborne is sort of a time capsule of that sort of 18th century country pastoral idyll that even a couple of decades after Gilbert White died would have seen like a very nostalgic alien thing that a lot of people, particularly during world wars, came back to feel at home. I think it also became more popular because the world caught up with the genius of Gilbert White. The way that he's often given the credit of being the father of ecology. He was the first person really to write about nature as an ecosystem. He was pioneering in the way that he described nature. He called it observing narrowly, where he would take something and really, really take it down to the basics, watching it in life, not in death, to see how it behaved. Like the title of the talk, he was an outdoor naturalist. And the observations that he made 250 years ago are still as accurate today as they were then, because birds, animals and plants still behave the same way now, even though we might not have so much of it. So Gilbert White is also credited with a few other scientific discoveries. He was the first person to note the difference between the chiffchaff, the wood warbler and the willow warbler. If you've ever seen them all together, they are quite similar looking birds and not easy to distinguish. But Gilbert White noted that they had three very distinct sets of song, which helped him realize that these were actually three different species. Gilbert White actually focuses quite a lot on bird song. One thing that always comes to mind is he noticed that owls in Selborne, at least, hoot in B flat. He was the first to recognize the harvest mouse as a separate species. There's a really lovely project that happened a couple of years ago where harvest mouse were reintroduced to the land around Selborne, which was a really successful conservation project. Gilbert White really lovely describes harvest mice nests like cricket balls. He was also the first to identify the nocturnal bat. And I was talking about him being the father of ecology. One of the things that comes to mind is that he was one of the first to really appreciate the earthworm. Before Gilbert White, I'm pretty sure that most people believe that earthworms are being put on Earth simply to annoy gardeners. But Gilbert White could really see the benefit that they gave the rest of the world. And to sort of paraphrase Gilbert White, he said that the loss of them would create a lamentable chasm. He saw that the loss of this species would be detrimental to the whole world, you know, not just bad news for the earthworm itself. And that included man. He was one of the first people to recognize that man didn't own nature, man was part of nature. And his descriptions and his observation on the earthworm is where you can most see Gilbert White in Darwin. Darwin was a huge fan of Gilbert White. In fact, he came to Selborne on a pilgrimage to see White Selborne, and very much considered himself as standing on the shoulders of Gilbert White, continuing his work. And I'd like to think that Charles Darwin would be horrified to find out that he has pretty much eclipsed Gilbert White in terms of fame and recognition. But it's in Darwin's observations and theories about earthworms that I think you can see the most of Gilbert White. And then the last picture, I mean, this is just a snapshot of some of the things that Gilbert White does remarkably in the Natural History of Selborne, is the swallows. So Gilbert White was particularly interested in birds, but more specifically migratory birds, and of them Swiss swallows and house martins pop up frequently. The 18th century had mixed ideas about migration. In an era where international travel was a huge undertaking, the idea that birds could fly from Selborne to Africa and then back again seemed impossible. And you can sort of see that thought process. A lot of naturalists did believe in migration, but then a lot of naturalists also believed that birds hibernated, and many believed that birds hibernated underwater. Gilbert White did not subscribe to that school of thought. However, although he did subscribe to the thought of migration, he constantly talks of evidences of birds migrating. The idea of migration troubled him. The idea that, particularly with swifts and swallows, these very delicate birds, particularly ones that were, you know, very recently hatched and fledged, could undertake this journey, was particularly troubling to Gilbert White on a sort of emotional level, you could almost say. Particularly for a man who did not travel himself. He only went as far north as Rutland, only as far east as Essex, and only as far west as Devon. In an old age, he suffered from very acute coach sickness. So definitely towards the end of his life, he was pretty much south of England bound. I think the idea of these delicate birds flying to Africa and back was both puzzling and troubling. So what about Gilbert White today? This is the Wakes today, and it looks very different from the picture that you're seeing. In fact, it's from a completely different angle. So actually most of the house that you saw is hidden out of shot or behind this tree here. The rest of this red brick roof was added by subsequent families. After Gilbert White died, the house passed to relative, but by sort of the mid-19th century, the house was in the possession of other families who all added rooms, floors, wings to the house. So it is now a large house, whereas before it was relatively small. In the 1950s, the house came up for sale and was bought by the newly founded Gilbert White Trust. Its principal patron was a gentleman called Robert Washington Oates, who funded the opening of the museum on the proviso that the museum would be a joint museum celebrating Gilbert White and the Oates family. And the two principal members of the Oates family that the museum celebrates are Frank Oates, who was a 19th century naturalist and explorer, and Lawrence Oates, otherwise known as Captain Oates or Titus Oates, who went with Scott to the South Pole in 1912 as part of the Terra Nova expedition. So the legacy of the house lived on, but in a very different way. And here's a nice picture of people enjoying the gardens. So this year, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, is Gilbert White's tercentenary. And after years of planning and essentially 18 months of very serious planning of lots of events all over the country and lots of a really full-packed year, it has not been the tercentenary that we expected, but with the loss of all of our Gilbert White 300 events, we actually had a year where really we got down to the essentials of what Gilbert White was about. We realised during lockdown, when the museum was closed and we were all at home, we were forced to get out into our garden and to go on local walks around our near our home and start appreciating nature. And nature responded by being sort of much more numerous and diverse than it had been in the past. So we started the hashtag Be More Gilbert, because actually in this year we've probably been more Gilbert than I think in any other year before, and I think that's a really perfect way to celebrate his tercentenary. And I will finish by just showing you a picture of one of the things that we had started planning a few years ago that did go ahead this year, which was unveiling a statue of Gilbert White, all 5'2" of him, to the garden in July. Alan Titchmarsh did the honours for us on the 21st of July. The statue sits on top of Baker's Hill and looks over towards the hangar, and is seated underneath the maple tree that the Duke of Wellington planted on the day that the museum opened, which I think was a very fitting response to the fact that we had only just reopened the grounds after several months of being shut due to lockdown. So that's me, really. It was a very potted history of Gilbert White's life and why he is so important, but I'm sure there's lots of other things that we can discuss in the Q&A. So if you do have any questions, please pop them in the chat below, and then we will get started. Oh, that was pretty much spot on for an hour too. So yes, if you've got any questions, you can either type them in the chat box, or if you can raise a virtual hand. I know there's a few things I haven't mentioned. I haven't even gone into Timothy or anything like that. So we got anybody? Yi, do you have a question or?
Unmute.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'm David James.
Hi, David.
I'm a member of the Selborne Society, which looks after Perivale Wood in London. But near to us in Acton, in West London, we have a plaque to Richard White, founder of one of the founders of the Law Society, and I believe he was a cousin of Gilbert White. Just wondered if they ever met up.
I mean, it sounds plausible. I have to say, I lose track of Gilbert White's nephews and nieces. So by the time Gilbert White was in his 70s, he had 62 nephews and nieces. He was counting the children of his nephews and nieces and their partners in that number, but yeah, so it was you do lose track of them pretty quickly, and they're all called the same thing. They're all Gilberts and Johns and Benjamins, but that, you know, if yeah, it could well be one of Gilbert's relatives. They're out there. And if anybody, there's a video actually, I keep mentioning videos on our YouTube page, but there is a really great video about the Selborne Society and why it's called the Selborne Society. So, because, you know, it's not an obvious link, but it's a really interesting history. So there's a question in the chat. So Joe, do you want to ask your question out loud?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wasn't sure if I got it right, but I thought you said Gilbert was the eldest son. So I wondered why, was it Timothy inherited his mother's family's money?
So yes, you're right. So Gilbert was the eldest, but his brother Thomas inherited his mother's side. I think that wasn't through his mother. So Gilbert so when Anne married John White, John White would have obviously now then owned Anne's dowry, but the inheritance obviously would have gone through her brothers. And I think there was I'm not an expert, but I think the sort of a tradition was that the first son would be provided for. So if there was any sort of extra wealth, that they would quite often pick the second born. And it just so happened that Thomas did far better off being second born than Gilbert did being firstborn, because actually when John White, Gilbert's father, died, Gilbert really didn't benefit at all. He didn't even inherit the house because the house was part owned by John, but part owned by Gilbert's uncle. So he had to wait. Well, he didn't wait, but it wasn't until Charles White died that Gilbert actually owned the house that he had lived in for 40, 30 years.
Fascinating, convoluted, isn't it?
It's really complicated, and that's why Gilbert White got in such a pickle with Oriel College, because they just assumed that after his father died that the house and lands would belong to Gilbert, but it really wasn't that easy. And he really didn't make a lot of friends by having to sort of plead his poverty. at the age of 39 years old, saying, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to still have my uni money because I can't afford to keep myself going on what I earn from my job.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
About that. Obviously, one of the most famous stories that accompany Gilbert White is Timothy the tortoise, which originally belonged to his aunt, Rebecca Snook, and Gilbert inherited Timothy the tortoise on Rebecca's death in 1780. And from that point, the diaries are full of references to Timothy. Gilbert White was particularly interested in tortoises, and Timothy had a hard life being the pet of a naturalist, being subjected to lots of experiments, including being put on the edge of the ha-ha to see if he had the spatial perception not to fall off the edge. He did. Whether he whether his hearing was very good, he was shouted at for a hearing trumpet. But I think the worst of all he was subjected to was being dunked into a barrel of water to see if he could swim. He could not. The tortoise, Timothy, lived a year longer than Gilbert White did. But after Timothy died, it was discovered that actually Timothy is female. You can visit Timothy. They are in the Natural History Museum in their reptile section, just behind the cafe. And there he is. So for everyone to see, but the Natural History Museum assure me that Timothy definitely 100% is female. Right, so Maisie, do you want to ask your question? Well, so Maisie asks, can we view his book, view the book? You absolutely can. So you can do it multiple ways. It's on, if you want to read it for free online, it is on Project Gutenberg, which is a really fabulous resource for books that are out of copyright. But you can also, if you go to our website, the Gilbert White's House website, you can read the manuscript. So we digitized the manuscript a couple of years ago. And so if you want to read it in Gilbert's own hand, feel free to do so. If not, it is available online on Project Gutenberg, and I'm sure lots of other places.
Sorry about that. I was my kids were noises. I couldn't.
No, that's all right.
I was screaming in the background as I was a kid trying to...
No, that's all right. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so I just wanted to see, because I've just watched another webinar about historical books, and I was thinking it's fascinating because they had I think the Norfolk Heritage Centre had like online books that you could actually view, and I was just thinking that maybe it would be interesting to actually be able to see what the book looks like, and then I can show my kids as well, because I'm trying to encourage them to look at historical books and things like that as well. So
absolutely. Well, I said on our website we have the manuscript digitized. Gilbert White had pretty good handwriting.
That's good.
Tuned into it, it's not too hard to read, but yeah, it's out of copyright, so it is available online.
Brilliant.
And available in all good bookshops, because it hasn't gone out of print yet. It's 231 years and counting, but every now and again another publisher drops it and we're like, oh no, we're gonna have to change our strap line.
Brilliant, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Any other questions? You know, if you feel free to raise a hand if you don't want to put it in the chat box. Otherwise, we will. I mean, I should say as well that we are, there are lots of other things going on in the Winchester Heritage Open Days program, and so you should definitely tune into that. We have some really good, interesting Gilbert White related online talks happening at the museum this autumn. We have one on historic apples, so if any gardeners amongst you. We have one on the annotations that Gilbert White noted in his personal books. And so we've got some really interesting things coming up. So if you're obviously very keen on online talks, that's lots of stuff to do. I hope there's some 300 merchandise for sale. There is a little bit. Yeah, so if you come to Selborne and visit our shop, we've got mugs and badges and magnets with Gilbert White 300 on it, and some tote bags, I think, as well. So there's a little bit of merch available for Gilbert White 300, and I wouldn't be doing my job as collections and marketing manager to persuade you and to try and, if you can, come down to Selborne and see the place yourself, because I don't think you can really get a feel of Gilbert White and how the landscape informs the writing without actually seeing Selborne and seeing the view that he had from his windows, and seeing how it's basically impossible not to be a naturalist. I mean, I've become a naturalist, and before I started working at Gilbert White's, I knew nothing about nature. I mean, I wouldn't say I was a naturalist now, but I certainly know an awful lot more about the natural world than I did a few years ago. Any last questions before we say goodbye? Doesn't look like it. Well, brilliant. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. This will be up on YouTube as soon as I can download it and then re-upload it to YouTube. Thank you for supporting Gilbert White 300 and supporting Heritage Open Days. Thank you. That's great. Thank you very much. Bye. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.